This is an FIA document that was released after the Austrian Grand Prix with all of the deleted lap times where drivers exceeded track limits. It's 3 pages long, starting with Lewis Hamilton and ending with Sebastian Vettel. And in the 71 laps across the 20 drivers, there was 43 offenses of exceeding track limits. That works out to 2.15 warnings per driver, which is funny because after 2 warnings, the drivers are given a black and white flag for driving standards, and if you then got a third, it's an automatic 5-second penalty. Needless to say, the drivers weren't exactly happy with how strict the track limit rules were being enforced this weekend, with championship leader Max Verstappen having this to say after the race.
Track limits. I think track limits debate this weekend has been a bit of a joke, not only in F1 but in F2 and F3. Like, it's easy to say from the outside, yeah, but you have to just stay within the white lines. Yeah, I mean, it sounds very easy, but it's not, because when you go that quick through a corner, and some of them are a bit blind, if you have a bit more understeer tires or wearing, it's easy to just go over the white line. But do you actually gain time? Maybe yes, maybe not. And to be honest, it's only like 2-3 corners where you can really just go a bit wider. And yeah, I don't think we should have this, you went 1 mil over, that's, a penalty or whatever.
I'm going to pause the clip there. Now, controversially or not, I actually disagree with pretty much everything Max said there. Now, this isn't anything to do with Max, because a lot of the drivers, and pretty much all of them actually, said basically the same thing. But he summarized quite a few interesting points really well. I actually think that specifically when it comes to policing track limits in Austria, although it wasn't perfect in the race, I actually think that the FIA were right to be strict with the track limits the way they were. Firstly, why is Austria the track where this track limits debate seems to have been bigger than anywhere else yet? Austria has always been a track where the drivers can gain a huge amount of lap time by opening up the exit and running wide on the curbs. Just the nature of the track itself, with its undulation, the fast, sweeping corners, and also the flat exit curbs, just invites the drivers to push in those fast corners and also use more of those curbs to gain lap time. But it's also a tricky track to get right, because many of those corners and apexes are actually blind, which means that when you're low down in the cockpit, it's extremely difficult to place your car perfectly within the white lines. This is something that as fans, it's difficult to comprehend. When we see the onboard shots of the drivers, yes, it looks easy to see where the apex is, and then where the white line is on the exit, but let's not forget that this is not even close to the vantage point that the drivers have. What also makes it even more difficult are these brand new generation of F1 cars with their bigger tires and also with the winglets on top of the wheels as well. It's actually something that Daniel Ricciardo mentioned after qualifying, and to get a better representation of what the driver's point of view is, if we take a look at Lando Norris, who wore the helmet cam, it gives a much better representation of what the drivers can see, or maybe can't see is a better way to phrase it. Using Lando cam, we can firstly see just how quick these cars are, which we mustn't forget by the way, and also that you've basically got to turn in and trust that your car will stick with the tires and fuel load that you have, because it's almost impossible to do mid-corner corrections. Something else Austria related that Max said in his interview is, quote, "There's only like 2 or 3 corners where you can go wider." Now, the reason why this is important is that even though officially Austria has 10 corners, in reality for F1 cars, there's only 7 corners where you need to brake and accelerate, and that's turns 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, and 10. Austria is the shortest track in terms of lap time on the 2022 calendar, and if you can gain time on 3 out of the 7 corners, which is 43%, that's almost half the track where you can potentially exceed track limits and gain time. That's why Austria is a track where track limits have always been a talking point. The nature of the track in combination with the 2022 cars means that, especially in Sector 3 at turns 9 and 10, which are the last 2 corners, it's very difficult to be able to push for lap after lap and not step over the limit and step over the white line. Something else in reference to what Max said in his interview is that mid-sentence he tried to ask a dismissive and rhetorical question of, do the drivers actually gain time by running wide?
If you have a bit more understeer tires are wearing, it's easy to just go over the white line, but do you actually gain time?
Then he paused and realized, yeah, you actually do gain time by running wide.
Maybe yes, maybe not. And
I just thought that it was a funny moment because the very reason drivers run wide is to gain time. By being able to run wider on the curbs, you can open up the steering, which allows you to carry more speed and also use less of your tires. Now, even though we have to take the opinion of drivers in high regard, I mean, they're the ones in the car, we also have to remember that they're selfish. I mean, for anyone who follows me on Instagram, you'll know that I actually compete in karting championships, and even I can tell you that if there is a place to run wide and gain time, I will find and use that piece of tarmac. And it's the same in Formula 1. So even if the drivers are frustrated with how strict the track limits are, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're speaking to make it better for the whole grid. But now let's talk about the Austrian Grand Prix weekend specifically. We know the drivers were not happy with how strict the track limit rules were, but do they have a point, and did the stewards perhaps go a little bit over the top? From my point of view, because Austria is such an easy track for exceeding track limits, there was always going to be a lot of warnings and penalties. Usually on bigger tracks, there's only really like 2 or 3 corners where track limits are a big deal. So the exit of turn 4 in Bahrain, the exit of Copse at Silverstone, and the penultimate corner in Austin are a few examples. But it's not about Austria, it's about consistency across the board. At the beginning of the season, the FIA very clearly outlined that for 2022, the white line was going to define the track on every track. And this actually came from conversations with the drivers after last year. And this is classic F1. The drivers wanted more transparency and more consistency after track limits were different from track to track last year, and now that the FIA want to do exactly what the drivers wanted, now the drivers are frustrated because they find it harder to push the limits on a tricky track. This is why Austria had to happen. This was the hard-hitting precedent where it was most obvious, and hopefully now it will continue and cause the drivers to adjust, even on the tracks where track limits aren't as much of an issue. Now, I do also want to say that it wasn't completely perfect. As far as I'm aware, the FIA don't have a corner-to-corner automated system where, like on the Formula 1 game, it could just recognize and automatically give drivers warnings and penalties. The FIA actually picked out critical corners before the weekend where they told the drivers that track limits would be monitored. Those corners were turns 1 and the final sequence of corners with 9 and 10. However, this did cause a bit of controversy at turn 8, which is a corner the stewards weren't monitoring as much. This was the weak link in the chain. In quali, it was very obvious that Checo crossed the line on his fastest lap in Q2, which got him into Q3. Even I saw it in real time and tweeted about it straight away. It actually kept Pierre Gasly out of Q3 when he should have gone through, and Checo was only pushed back after the end of qualifying itself, after he had already participated in Q3. The stewards said that the reason it took until after the end of quali is that they were investigating multiple incidents in between Q2 and Q3 and just didn't have the time. Again, this wasn't a good look, and it does show that more work needs to be done, and perhaps just more people need to be there to help the stewards if they can't handle all of the incidents. There is also an argument from drivers, like in the case of Lando Norris, who got a 5-second penalty in the race, that when he got his penalty, it was when he locked up going into turn 1 going wide, and he actually lost around a second doing so. So should warnings and penalties be given to drivers who make a mistake and actually lose time due to their own error? That frustration I do get, but again, Technically, you have 2 get out of jail free cards to run wide intentionally or not before you get a penalty. And ultimately, these are supposed to be the 20 best drivers in the world. That's the challenge for every driver. You have to judge how hard you can push, how much grip your tires can give you so that you don't go wide and exceed track limits, and also for you to stay within the white lines that define the edge of the racetrack. Although the 43 warnings might look ridiculous, and there are things to improve on the FIA side, and also with how track limits are monitored, Austria was a necessary evil on a track that's notorious for track limits. Were the FIA right to be as strict as they were? Did it take away from the racing? I'm not sure. In a way, I thought it added an extra bit of jeopardy to the racing, especially when we knew the drivers were on their final warning. But what do you think? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments box below, and that wraps up another video. If you did enjoy this one, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, that would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.